We also develop maps out as well for different projects or purposes, or even part of our research. And for today's workshop, we thought maybe we'd have like a small explanation of how maps are tools for storytelling, how they contribute, how they could be a story on their own, or how they could aid storytelling as they represent maybe the thoughts or a lot of the things that the cartographer or person making these maps, what they think, and also how they see something at a certain time and space, or how it is as they think it is. And we have 3 parts in this workshop. At first, I will be explaining some different concepts, and then also I'm going to show you how we usually create maps and how we use them to tell stories. And the last part would be me answering questions if anyone has any questions. And this goes for people joining us on Zoom, as well as people who are watching from Facebook. So should we start the presentation? Cool. Okay. So I hope that everyone can see the presentation. Okay. So I will start by a story of a map, actually. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so this map we're looking at was created in 1884 by an entity called the Patriotic something, I forgot the name. We'll see it in the next slide in a short. It was created to explain a lot of parts of Abyssinia and Sudan. It has several parts. And as you can see, it explains a lot of the city on the Nile, as well as movement routes that are known and that that time between different cities in around Sudan. As you can notice, right in the south of the map, there is Khartoum, which is actually supposed to be the main character for this story. And then this maps, some years later, around 13 years later, was used as part of a pamphlet. So there are a lot of maps out there that explain different types of history, or they explain different geographical locations, or they explain something or another. But I chose this map because it was actually used to tell a story to for the general public in England at the time, which is 1887. So what was told in this map, with this map actually, was the story of Sudan at that time. Few years before that, Gordon has fell, and then the Mahdiya came to became a state, or and it took it destroyed what the city used to be in Khartoum, and then built Omdurman on the west of the Nile. And how the story was told in this pamphlet was that around that time the French troops has moved to south of this area, to Fashoda, as part of their colonialism, and this pamphlet was distributed to convince the people that it was very important for them now to conquer Sudan. If we go to the next slide. This is the pamphlet, and this is one part of a very detailed explanation of how this move by the French was threatening to Britain or England, and it was a political statement, and also it was explaining how Kitchener must move to Khartoum and reclaim back or actually avenge Gordon, because through that they will be saving the people of Sudan. In other parts of this pamphlet, they also describe a lot of the cities we see in this map, how its history, how it came to be at that time, and also the value of its exports and imports, and actually what they grow every year. So the pamphlet was actually the same way you would look like any type of document that is trying to sell you something. But in this case, it's trying to convince the people that occupying another country was necessary. And to explain all of these different locations, Khartoum, the Nile, Fashoda, or all the cities, they had to use the map as a medium for storytelling. If we go to the next slide. And from this concept, we could look into how other maps actually are used, are actually other way around. They're actually maps that are based on storytelling. If you go to the next slide. This map, for example, was built on storytelling. A group of people who lived in Omdurman during the Khalifa time were describing how the city was during the time. And then this map went to Orwalder, who was a captive in Omdurman for 10 years. And he corrected what he thought, or from his memory, how the city was during that time. So if you look at this map, it's actually not, it's not actually accurate. If we like spread it on a physical space now, it will not fit anything. But it's actually based on the memory or description of the people who were there and how they remember things from that time, or how it was. So you find things that are bigger or smaller than it actually is, but it's more of how they remember it, or how they see it, or how it was, or so on. Another story, or another type of, if we go to the next slide, another type of maps that is actually a storytelling, or actually they're designed or made to tell a certain moment, not just a static moment, but actually something that happened, or the battle maps, specifically the maps that were in the River War book that was written by Winston Churchill. For example, we're looking here at the Battle of Adbara, and how different troops were standing, and also explains a certain how exactly a certain time not just like what was the where was each side of the war or the battle were standing, what were they doing at the time, and also what was like the formation style was, and what was the strategy of the battle, and all of that. So what we understand from this, that usually there are like several maps for one battle explaining a different time of the battle or a different moment or significant thing, and sometimes they even include the number of people who died in one spot and all of that. So just looking at this map, it's almost like reliving or looking at the moment of the battle. So all of this got me to the point of what is map making and what is a map. And I actually, even though I know what is a map, I've been working with this for a while, tried to look for like a definition to use, but actually found so many I couldn't really decide which one to put. But the one that I mostly found that was close to how I see maps is the one in the next slide. Yeah, so it's actually a map is a symbolic representation of selected characteristics that are linked to place or space, such as objects, regions, or themes. But with this definition, what I found was lacking, that it's specific. It's trying to make it that we're talking just about the physical space we know today. But in actually, if you go to the next slide, you actually can draw or make maps about almost anything you can think of. You can make maps of fictional locations, you can make maps of physical space or the sky, or you can make maps of the brain or the DNA, you can make maps of statistics or for actually statistics or numbers or phenomena or anything. It depends on it's in the end, it's just associating a certain thing with a certain space or a place or any thing that it's whether it's actually real or in a digital place or in a imaginary of a writer or anything. And looking at this very, very broad understanding, there's actually a lot of yes, we could basically draw a map for everything, but yes, there are certain types that now are more used than others, or like they're in professional context. For example, we all, or like you could get a map for your land, or you can get a map for the streets in your city, or you could get a map for anything that you might use day to day, whether it was a satellite image or it was drawn by someone. But that doesn't mean that they're like, these are the only types that you can have or see. Because even if you look at a physical space or the city, a map change its purpose when you change the focus. And when you, for example, if you're more interested in the streets, then you could disregard anything and focus on the street. Or if you want to draw a map for a certain built environment or a geographical feature of a space, or if you want to draw a map for statistics of number of people with a certain age, in a place and you want to associate that number with that space. So what I wanted to get out of this is if we have this very broad this viewpoint to maps, what if you or me or anyone wants to draw a map, and how would you start? If you have a story you want to tell through a map, the same way all of the stories I mentioned earlier were told through maps, how would you do that? And for that, I prepared a few points. The one after this. Yeah, so usually what I described earlier of focus point or making people look at a certain part of a map, usually how you do that is by thinking of a title or a name or a topic for your map. That usually is what guides you when you are trying to tell or trying to produce a map in general. What are you trying to get people to look at or understand? What are you trying to tell them? And where are you trying to guide them? So usually when you pick a topic or a name for your map or a title, you do that so you narrow down all of these different endless possibilities that can go into a map. So if I want to produce a map for my city or a neighborhood, for example, in this time of today, for the purpose of knowing where all the trees are. So I know already that I'll be looking at all the trees in my city, and it's or my neighborhood, I mean, and it's in the area or scale of, let's say, usually you have to let people know what are they looking at. Is it like a very tiny thing or a very big thing? And then you need to like give them like a grid or a parameters of the overall context where your map is located. So if you don't want to put, like, for example, a specific, let's say, like north, south, something like that, like a specific number of where exactly this map is located, you could like put a landmark, like a known thing for the person who's going to look at this map and immediately know what they're looking at, and then they would tell from there. If you're telling a story and you've described a big tree in your story, and then you drew a map for that story and placed a big tree, everyone would know what they're looking at. And eventually, some maps actually include a key that usually tells them if you're having a lot of information in that map, and you need them to understand what they're looking at, you put up extra information of, for example, this dot or this color or this line means this height or this city or that, or and so on. So usually most maps include at least some of these, or if not all of these elements. And from this, I would like to go to how we usually produce maps, or how we usually look into storytelling and associate it with maps. In the last slide, actually. So this what we're looking at now is 5 maps that we've produced for a museum. And the thing is, why I picked this specific map to show you is because museum is a place you go for storytelling, actually. And it was very interesting when we were asked to produce these maps, because they were supposed to tell a story of how Omdurman was created. But because, as we know, any story, there is facts and there is incidents that happen, but it always differs depending on how you narrate it or how you make people focus. The same way a map is a tool where you could make people focus on a certain point or not, or like you could use a map to make people look at one thing rather than the other. Storytelling is actually like that. So for these 5 maps, we had to tell the story of Umdurman, but there is like a lot of things. It's a city in the end. We could tell the story of the city in endless ways or a lot of ways. But what was interesting that we were supposed to explain a lot of concepts and events that were usually the curators has decided that they will be shown in the remaining spaces of the museum. So it was not just telling the story of the Umdurman, it's actually explaining to the people how they will perceive the space they're in and the museum, and how they will go about, like it would be like they're supposed to have certain ideas in their head from looking at these maps that then they would reflect on when they see it in other exhibited areas or rooms or so on. So I think if this is working, I would like to explain or break down this actually map to you. If I could go back to showing my screen. Yes, okay, sorry. Okay. So this usually what I'm going to show here is actually most of how usually we go about designing maps, and actually what's the thinking process for us, and how we think of different elements, or how we think of the story itself, and then how we break it down and then build it up again in a map. So usually we use any type. We usually use paper like this that has a grid or something, so we could know the area we're working on. In like, even if it's a sketch and we're just developing the idea, but it helps us understand what you call the area we're working on. Yeah. So because now I don't have like a reference with me, but I will start by drawing the Nile as we all know it. Usually when we're dealing with something about Khartoum, we always almost start with the Nile because it's the easiest way to understand the city. So usually this is the River Nile, and it starts from the White and the Blue Nile. And somewhere here is Tuti. Sorry. Yeah, so this is a very rough drawing, but what we're looking at, because we were supposed to explain the history of the city in 5 different times, we've decided that, okay, we want people to understand certain concepts from years 1850 and the Siege of Khartoum, so 1884, and also the Khalifa time, so so towards the end we were, and then also the Battle of Karari, and finally we wanted to explain some things that happened after that during the colonial time. So we chose 1920. So these are like the years we were thinking of for this map, and we we couldn't change the Nile in each one, so we decided that we would choose one version of it, or like one time, which is today. And it's actually much easier for us to do it that way, because we already know how the Nile looks like today more than we know how it did, let's say 100 years ago. There's a certain things that we know about. For example, we know the flooding area in the city. We know some how, for example, Khor Anja has changed a little bit or anything. But in general, it's better if for the accuracy, we wanted to stick with something that we were very sure of. And because the map is supposed to do a lot of things, we wanted to make it very, very simple. And it shouldn't have a lot of things in it. It's supposed to just explain very simple concepts. So for example, one thing the curators really were trying to show in the exhibition space is the concept of movement and how people moved about Sudan, both in actually most of the dates we've talking about. And one thing was because Durman during the Turkish time, Egyptian Turkish rule, where this is the city of Khartoum was built. Usually you find it with 4 gates. The gate of Burri, which actually was next to or close to the area of Burri, which was actually a group of small villages. And there is the one towards Kereri, and then there is Al-Musallamiyya, where the bridge is located now, and I think there's a 4th one. And then there's also all sorts of forts, the one in Mugran, then there's one here. And then during that time, Bahri didn't have the name Bahri, so it was Khojali usually, and also Hilat Hamad or Hamad, the two, and then there's also smaller human settlements there. And also Durman had a lot of different human settlements or people living there. So for example, Kereri, or and then also Halfaya also was very significant. Towards the south a bit, there is Soba. But what we're trying to really focus on here is actually Al-Murada, or where the Nile port used to be, or still is actually. It's a very old port. And why we wanted to do that? Because during the time this was happening here, what was more significant about the space was human movement or people moving in this location. So what we did was we tried to explain the concept of how people moved through this area, through Durman. This was the most significant thing to the story we're trying to tell, is this movement concept of how people came from Western Sudan, from Al-Ubail, or starting the trade route, which actually, if you noticed earlier when I was showing the first maps, we saw a lot of these routes. But it was very important to the economic prosperity of the space, or the how this place had its character, and so on. So then after that, in 1884, the Siege of Khartoum happened. And what was very interesting, what we really wanted to explain about this is how for a full year, the Mahdi and his forces were all around the city. It was a tactic for them to like get to break down the system. And then they also had forces in the north, in Bahri, and they had Gordon had the fort here, which was one of the first that fell down or under the control of the Mahdi. And basically for a year, this place was basically at the mercy of the Mahdi forces until on this side of the city, there was when the Nile flooded, some of the wall of the city fell, and they could actually go in, and then Gordon died, and the Mahdi or the city, the state, the new era started. But just few months after that, the Mahdi died, and the new ruler of the time became the Khalifa of the Mahdi. And because of this, what we knew, the city of Khartoum obviously was destroyed. People were moved from this to the western side of the Nile, because this was one of the last things the Mahdi did before he died. And a new city was built here. But this old line of movement now has become something else. So in order for the city to get built or to happen or to exist, a lot of people had to come for different reasons. Whether they came here for opportunities, they were moved, they were forced, whatever the reason they came to here. And this movement line has become a controlled line, because it was I don't know what's the right way to phrase it, but it was a controlled state. So things like the movement people usually had going through the Nile, or the trade route, or everything was controlled by whatever decisions was enforced by the Khalifa at the time. And actually, a lot of the religious events that usually people went through this line, because it actually leads to Sawakin or Mecca. Usually a lot of people come through here because they're going to pilgrimage, or because of economic situation. But a lot of religious activities were now happening here in the dome, or the tomb of the Mahdi. And that's why a lot of people came here also for religious reasons as well. And then when, like the pamphlet mentioned earlier, where it was explaining how Britain it was very important for them now to invade or occupy Sudan. They already started from the north. They started taking different cities or occupying different cities, but the most important one was to defeat the Khalifa, because he was the ruler at the time. And what we would notice that the line of movement has changed now from east to west to actually north-south, because as I mentioned earlier, the interest was always to protect the Nile, and also the line of the economic, let's say, the interests of the British at the time. So right here in Kerry, which was a few kilometers from Omdurman, was the battle that happened. And then the Khalifa was defeated in it, but he didn't die in this battle. He actually fled and tried to come back to Omdurman a couple of times before he eventually died in Umdibekrat. So this was the interest, but also the Nile as well was also a very key thing, because, for example, the main reason this the Khartoum was chosen as the main city during the Turkish time was because, for example, this Nile or riverfront, and it was supposed to be a protective part. And then also the Khalifa, also when he built his city, and he had all these walls and forts actually all around the city, was because they knew that the Nile was always going to be where the enemy would come from or come through. And actually they even used it when they were when they were during the Siege of Khartoum, I mean. So in the first day, the troops of Kitchener destroyed all of the forts and the wall from the Nile, and then the second day Kerry happened, and by the time they arrived to Omdurman, the Khalifa had left, and then they continued going south as the plan intended, which is to free the Nile and waterways actually. And eventually we go to the final map, which is supposed to explain what happened after that. And even though Omdurman was destroyed through that time, it was rebuilt with minimal changes. So it remained most of the streets that we know of. And usually this is like the market, and this is the anyway. It's actually had a lot of the characteristics that it used to have, but when for Khartoum it was completely rebuilt from the beginning. What is remaining actually what was remaining after that was like this line, which is now Al-Qiyada route, which is following the old wall of the city. And also the location of the palace, where like everything was like built around. And then this became, and because they wanted to enforce this line of power of the waterway remained like in the White Nile, so they had a lot of infrastructure that aided this. And then also they built, they continue working on the railway, which was only on the eastern side of the Nile. Okay, so it's hard to anyway. Yeah. So what we wanted also to explain from these lines, that this route of movement that used to be very strong is no longer there. It was replaced by these lines that went towards the Nile, which also could be seen how the city developed. It's more almost following these lines. So yeah, so this was the story of Omdurman that we really wanted to tell. And if you've noticed from the presentation, that it was a very simple map. It only included these lines that I actually drew in front of you, and it had very short captions that explained very minimally all of these story things that I mentioned. So I think I could take questions now. So this is a question from Larissa. This is super fascinating. I'm wondering how can more people access the knowledge and maps you generated in the museum, online or publication. So the thing is, for this specific, actually, if you notice, I didn't really show the entire maps because you actually have to go to the museum to see them. I only showed them because I really wanted to explain how we usually do this. But actually, if you want to see the maps, you have to go to the museum. It's the Khalifa House Museum in Durman, but if you follow our page, we'll show when it will get open, hopefully, and you can go and see everything there. I think to conclude this, I would like to show you a sneak peek to our exhibited piece in the exhibition space. So if you go to the exhibition, you would find all of the artists' great work. Our work is located inside the small circular structure inside the exhibition, which is about the art, our work, and the group we're collaborating with, KHHP, both worked on the concept of exhibition, archive. And our video, we have two videos, one in Arabic and English. It's the same video, but it's in different two languages. They show, I think we could like look at it. Yeah, okay.
Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, is a city with a long history full of various influences and circumstances that have shaped it into the city we see today. To examine this history, there are many means of knowledge available to us that archive the memory of the city and aid us in understanding history from numerous aspects and scales. However, due to our interest in the formation of the urban fabric of Khartoum, maps became the focus of our project, considering their essential role in the studies of the built environment, whether housing, planning and urban design, infrastructure and services. Maps, therefore, act as archives that document the different changes in the city through time and allow us to understand the impact of different urban planning policies on the formation of the city. So, to conduct our research, we needed to find historical maps of Khartoum. The search for maps was on two parallel tracks. We were researching online, but at the same time we tried to research different Sudanese entities and archives that might provide access to historical maps, such as the National Records Office, which is the National Archive for Sudan, that preserves all the historical documents from the Sennar Sultanate until today, to facilitate access to documents and allow them to be published according to the institution's law found at the website of the Ministry of Justice. So we appealed to several Sudanese governmental entities to grant us permission to access historical maps of Khartoum. But we were surprised to discover how difficult it is to access maps from Sudanese entities, and we could not understand the reasons why the requirements to access maps were impossible to meet, whether for individuals or even governmental and private entities, despite the fact that it is within our right to access this information. This is the current extent of our research within Sudanese archives, which is still ongoing, despite our failure to bypass the inaccessibility issue surrounding maps.
Hello. Okay. So this was like not a sneak peek. It's like a half peek into the video, which also talks about maps, but mainly as maps in the context of the archive, and a lot of issues related to it. So look at it, and if you have any questions or any comments, you could send them through Sudan Moves or our social media accounts that are an episode, and we will happily answer anything you have. Yeah, I think that's all. That's all, folks. Okay, bye.